Welcome to episode 58 of No Rares Required, a weekly podcast where I go over the commons and uncommons in a drafting archetype and kind of cover my strategy. And this week, Golgari Reanimator won the vote. And sadly, I just recorded this entire episode and realized that my microphone was muted. So if my voice is a little bit strained, it's because this is the second run through. But I'm going to try mixing things up a little bit this week and try a different approach. And I want to give you guys a glimpse into kind of the data analysis that I do when analyzing an archetype. And so if you're listening audio only, there will be some figures that I'll be referencing. And so I'll do my best to walk through the figures. But you might need to come to YouTube and check him out if you want the full experience. And just as a heads up. So to start things off, Golgari doesn't have a whole lot going for it in the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Its win rate is 54%, which is below the average win rate for people on 17 lands. And I think this is because there are a fair number of traps, specifically in black. And so, as usual, I will go over my draft skeleton, which is a strategy that is theoretical. It's a theoretical build where I limit myself to 15 commons, 7 uncommons, and 1 rare. And then try to build a deck that is cohesive enough and kind of figure out, like, okay, what colors do I mainly want to focus on, and like what the general theme is. And I think that what Golgari is doing the best in this set is reanimation. And Defossilize is the card that makes this whole thing work. And notably, Defossilize does work in other black archetypes, because black has the ability to self-mill through things like Marionette and Another Chance. But the Nurturing Bristleback, the 7-cost land cycler in green, I think puts it over the top for Golgari specifically. And you also want to keep your eyes out for the Deep Cavern Bat and the Chupacabra Echo at uncommon. Because black hasn't been performing particularly well compared to some of the other archetypes, you kind of need a reason, and those are perfectly good uncommons to pull you into the black archetype. And so remember to hit like and subscribe for daily Magic the Gathering content, and let me know if you like how I'm going to do this. I'd love to hear your feedback, always trying something new. So if you want, also every week I post a poll for the next archetype. So if you want to vote on that, come by YouTube and let me know what I should cover next week. And with that, let's get started. So this week I wanted to talk about my approach, right? And what I like to do first is calculate the total wins created on 17 lands. And I do this by taking the average of the games played win rate and the game in hand win rate on 17 lands. And this is following the methodology that was laid out by Carl, or 2 Duck Cubed, on Twitter. And I thought it was a really useful insight, and so I've just made it into a habit. And so after you've done that, and the reason why I take the average between the games played win rate and the game in hand win rate is games played is just if the card is in your deck. Game in hand is if it's only specifically when you end up with it in your hand. So like in a typical game of Magic, you only go through 20 cards in your deck, and so the card might not necessarily get its time to shine, right? And I think that between averaging the two, you generally get a pretty good weighted average of how good the card is performing. And then if you subtract the average win rate of the users that created the win rate for the card that you're looking at, then and multiply that by the number of games played by those players, you can see what are the outliers in the data, right? And so it kind of removes the player's skill, which is why I don't really tend to look at like top versus middle versus bottom. Just whatever has the largest amount of data, I think, is what's most useful, unless a card is specifically complicated to play correctly. So after multiplying it by the number of games played, you're left with the wins created for a card. And this gives you a really good list of the cards that have been creating the most wins. So like when they get picked and they get played, they have more of an opportunity to actually create a win. So you see a lot of commons and uncommons in this list. And so like for those listening audio only, you have Deep Cavern Bat, Pathfinding Axejaw, Poison Dart Frog, Join the Dead, Chupacabra Echo, Deathcap Marionette, Dead Weight, Hidden Necropolis, Defossilize, Hidden Nursery, Thrashing Brontodon, Another Chance, Watley's Final Strike, Creature of the Schism, which is the first rare on the list, Bitter Triumph, and Nurturing Bristleback. And so these are all commons and uncommons that perform quite well in the Golgari archetype and are ones that I'm looking, I look for during the draft. And similarly, we can do the kind of reverse of this, or I shouldn't say the reverse of this. We can look at the bottom of the list and see which ones have most hurt the deck the most, which ones have actually led to wins destroyed, right, or losses. And so if we look at the total wins destroyed, then we see the list is Deep Goblin Skulltaker, Basking Capybara, Broodrage Mycoid, Volatile Fault, Acolyte of Acolozots, Mephitic Draft, Queen Bay's Paladin, Deep Fathom Echo, Ukbin Bok the Great Mistake, Hidden Courtyard, Malamet Veteran, Sinuous Binthsaur, Sunken Citadel, Screaming Phantom, Bloodthorn Flail, and Hunter's Blowgun. And these are cards that they're not unplayable, right? Like, I actually think the Sinuous Binthsaur is pretty good, but maybe not strictly in a Golgari deck, right? Like, I would rather be multiple colors and have a significant amount of caves to really make the Binthsaur shine, right? So like, it's not necessarily that these cards are unplayable, but like, I'm not surprised to see that the top, Deep Goblin Skulltaker has been a very unimpressive card in my opinion, and to see it at the top of the list, kind of makes sense. Same with the Broodrage Mycoid and the Acolyte of Acolozots. I think this is largely one of the reasons that the black archetype has been struggling, is that you have some of these commons that are just not particularly good. But it gets a little bit, the real takeaway from all of this is the next little couple of steps here. And so what I like to do is I take the wins created that I just calculated, and then I divide them by the number of times that the card was picked. And you could divide it by the number of times that the card was played versus the card was picked. But I think there's some pros and cons to it. If you go off of the card that was picked, then ones that just get picked and put into the sideboard, you get a little bit more selection on what specifically the pick as opposed to the card, if that makes sense. But then if you graph this against the average taken at, or ATA, and fit the data with a logarithmic regression, you can then calculate the distance that the card is from the fitted line, which, thanks to Carl, aka 2duck we'll call this the value over replacement, or VORP. And we can see which are the top cards to take at different time points within a draft, which I think is really cool. So if we look at the VORP for picks 1 through 2.5, these are going to be picks 1, 2, and 3 are mostly going to be rares, and we see the top performing rares in the set, right? And these ones aren't particularly interesting for limited, because you're not really choosing a rare over another rare, usually. Usually there's just one rare in a pack, although I guess that could change soon. But anyway, we Acolazot's Deepest Betrayal has just been an absolutely fantastic card. We've got the Skullpore Nexus, which is specifically best in Golgari, and part of the reason is because, like, the Skull Spore Nexus costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, and Golgari is aiming to get the greatest power among creatures as quickly as possible. So it is the one that's like turn 5, I'm going to have a 9/9, or I'm going to have a 5/5, or I'm going to have a 7/7, or like, it's trying to do that as its kind of, well, at least my approach is trying to do that as its main strategy. So Skull Explorer Nexus is going to be cheapest in a deck that is trying to do that and being able to get this out. And it just works with the theme as well, right? Like if you're playing even Pathfinding Axe Straw, yeah, you make it into a 10/4 that when it dies, it comes back as a 10/10 that you then make into a 20/10. And this card is just, it's a busted mythic. And this is the reason why it's my draft skeleton. Like, it is specifically good in Golgari. And we've got Preacher of the Schism, which is great in all black decks, but is best in Golgari by a slim margin. And, I think it's because Golgari is the most interested in a 2/4 Death Toucher, which is better on defense. And being able to draw a card and lose 1 life does help you find your defossilize and get to your combo, if you will. And then we've got Osier Caverns, Deepest Growth. So as we go down this list, the value over replacement means like, how good is this over just another option, right? And so as we go down this list, we're going to start seeing things that aren't as specifically good in Golgari, right? So like Osier Caverns, Deepest Growth is best in Selesnya, where you have a higher creature count. In Golgari, you are more likely to drop a creature spell for a defossilize, right? Count the defossilize as a creature, or at least that's been my experience. And in Selesnya, you're more likely to just be leaning heavily into the creature strategy, have 17 plus creatures in your deck, and so I'm not surprised to see that the stats support that it's better in Selesnya. And then we've got Sentinel of the Nameless City, which is similarly, it's great in Golgari. It should be one of your pack ones that leads you into green, but it's better in Selesnya and Simic. And Selesnya, because its archetype is the increasing base power that works with Kutzil, and Simic kind of has a explore sub theme running through it. So the map tokens work really well for those 2 strategies. And then the last one that I'm going to cover, if you want the full list, again, it's available on YouTube, but the Pugnacious Hammer Skull, and this one is best in Gruul Dinos, Dinosaur Synergies. It gets better the more dinos that you're playing, and you have the most in red-green. But it works really well in Golgari too, because you just use it as a 6/6 wall for 3. And, maybe you have additional dinosaur synergies later in the game, or you're pathfinding axe draws. It's like, it doesn't need to be in Gruul to operate. But this is really where I think the utility of this approach really starts to shine. And this is when you start looking at picks 3 through 5 and onward. And this is where you start seeing what are the best commons and uncommons that should kind of push you towards that archetype. And so the list is for people on audio only: the Deep Cavern Bat, Chupacabra Echo, Bringer of the Last Gift, Thrashing Brontodon, Cenote Scout, Bitter Triumph, Join the Dead, Cosmium Confluence, Colossal Dactyl, Malamet Battleglyph, Earthshaker Dreadmaw, and Scampering Surveyor. So just I'll cover these a little bit more in detail. So to start things off, the Deep Cavern Bat is a top performing uncommon. In Dimir, I think it's mythic level. I think in Golgari it is as well. It's just been very impressive, because not only do you get a 1/1 lifelinker that can just ping away at your opponent and help you regain life, and is great for putting additional counters on and making it bigger, but it also can remove your opponent's interaction, and then they have to use interaction to get back the interaction that you took from them. So either way, they're going to be down interaction, and if they're using interaction to kill your 2-drop, then that's usually a good thing. And then we've got the Chupacabra Echo, which, as long as you can remove something from your opponent's board, is already coming in as a 2-for-1, which really helps outvalue your opponent. We've got the Bringer of the Last Gift, which is best in Golgari, and you can get it to work in Dimir as well, like any of the Descend strategies, which is like that soul tie space. But I think it works better in the Golgari strategy, because in blue-black, you can be doing like a Descend control thing where you don't actually have that many threats. But if you're if your goal was to from the get-go was to reanimate a big dino, then you've got to, you should, at least I hope, have some things that you're going to plan to hit with defossilize, right? And Bringer of the Last Gift lets you do the defossilize strategy while also wrathing your opponent and giving you a 6/6 flyer. So and then we've got the Thrashing Brontodon, which has been just a solid uncommon. Nothing spectacular about it in Golgari specifically. I mean, you don't have that many dinosaur synergies. It's not like Gruul. But being able to sacrifice it to destroy target artifact or enchantment has just made it a top performer. And then similarly, Cenote Scout has just been a really good green uncommon. You get a 1/1 that triggers Explore, so it's either a 1/1 that draws you a land, or it's a 2/2 on turn 1, which are both decent options in my opinion. We've got the Bitter Triumph, which is just good removal at uncommon in black, and then we've got Join the Dead, which is just good removal at common in black. And then we've got Cosmium Confluence, and after Cosmium Confluence, it starts to get kind of nitpicky, in my opinion. It just starts to become like, I could take it or leave it. So Cosmium Confluence is best in Golgari, and it allows you, if you have enough caves that so on turn 5, if you can have at least one cave in play, then you can immediately make a 9/9 that has haste. And that's kind of what you're trying to do with Defossilize anyway, is just get a big threat out for cheap. So it fits the Golgari theme as long as you are doing the cave thing. I haven't done the calculation yet for to have at least one cave at an 80% confidence interval on turn 5. But you can also use this to search your library for a cave card and put it into the battlefield tapped and then make it into a 6/6, and that's like an okay floor. So I don't even think you need that high of cave synergies, but it is best if you do have enough caves to get it into play tap, or to have the cave in play already when you play it. Just something to keep in mind. And because some of the other cave cards like the Bat Colony and things like that require like 9 or 10 caves in your deck, and like you don't need to go that into it for Cosmium Confluence. So it works better in an average Golgari deck. And if you really want to get into the specifics and the gritty details for multicolored and cave decks, I highly recommend Sam Black in the Drafting Archetypes podcast. Just had a wonderful episode on that specifically, so go check it out. And now for the VORP, or the value over replacement, for picks 5 through 8. And we see Defossilize, Pathfinding Axedraw, Poison Dart Frog, Deathcap Marionette, Nurturing Bristleback, Jade Seedstones, Dead Weight, River Herald Guide, Huatley's Final Strike, Soul Coil Viper, Tendril of the Micro Tyrant, Tithing Blade, Skullcap Snail, Akawali the Seething Tower, Armored Kincaller, and Explorer's Cache. So Defossilize, top of the list, not surprising to me, because that seems to be what Golgari is doing best, is exactly what Defossilize brings to the table. And it's, pairing this with the Nurturing Bristleback allows you to get a 5/5, a 3/3, and then explore twice on turn 5. As long as you can find the either land cycle it into your graveyard or get it into the graveyard with cards that trigger Descend. And then we've got Pathfinding Axedraw, which has been one of my favorite commons in green, because you either get a 5/4 or a 5/4 for 4 with dinosaur synergies, or you get a 4/3 that draws you a land. And both of these are good in my book. But it's and the other thing too is that, like, so Miner's Guidewing and Waterwind Scout and things like that, right? Like the blue white and the blue red, these archetypes are things that like people figured out are really good early on, right? And one of the nice things about Golgari is that you can pick up things like Pathfinding Axedraw when you normally would be picking up a common, right? You want to pick up your commons usually between picks 5 and 8, right? Instead of having to use one of your uncommon picks to pick up a common. So that's one of the upsides to this, is that Golgari is underperforming but also underdrafted. So people who are avoiding the green black space, you might be able to take advantage of that fact. That's all I'm trying to get at. Poison Dart Frog has been particularly good in all of the green archetypes. It does work really nicely in Golgari, mostly because there's kind of a gap on your 3-drop. So a lot of your 3-drop tends to be removal, like Join the Dead and Huatli's Final Strike, and like. But as far as like creatures go, if you look back at like my draft skeleton, Thrashing Bronodon is really the only card that I want to play on 3. And so being able to play on 2 and just skip to turn 4 and start doing your Pathfinding Axe draws on turn 3 is fantastic. And it helps you get to your Defossilize, maybe even on turn 4, just so that you can get an incredible amount of stats going super early and just completely beat down your opponent. And then it's a pretty good card defensively too, right? You get a 1/1 that has reach and can give itself Death Touch. I had a deck that had 5 of these that I called the Smile of Death, and it was one of my favorite decks. We got the Deathcap Marionette, which is good for enabling, filling your graveyard as long as you care about Descend. And then it's a good defensive card because you get a 1/1 Death Touch. You can trade up quite easily. And we've got the Nurturing Bristleback, which is the big payoff for your Defossilize. You want to get this into the graveyard, and if you have it in your hand, the fact that you can force cycle it to get it into the graveyard to reanimate is fantastic. We've got the Jade Seed Stones, which you can give a creature +3, or you distribute 3 +1/+1 counters, and then you can craft with the creature. And one of the things that's nice about Defossilize is it doesn't, the thing that you reanimate doesn't come back with an extinction counter, right? It doesn't have or a finality counter or whatever it's called, right? It doesn't get exiled when it dies. So this allows you to craft with it later. And so like, you reanimate your Bristleback, they have removal for it, and then you get to craft with it into a 7/7 that gains you 7 life. Because you gain life equal to the mana value of the exiled card, not the power. So, using your 7 cost, your big beef later for life gain just works particularly well in Golgari. And then we've got Deadweight, and Deadweight is pretty good. One of the things to keep in mind, though, is that like, it's not amazing. It's a little bit matchup dependent because you do have like, if you come up against other green decks, it's going to struggle a little bit to find value. Whereas like it's really good at removing the blue-white flyers and to some extent the blue-red pirates as well. But it, and it fills your graveyard. It does help you with Descend. But it was one of, it's a decent card. I don't know why I'm so down on it, but like I've been burned by it too many times is probably why. And then we've got the River Herald Guide, which similar to the Pathfinding Axe draw and the Cenote Scout has just been the green creatures that explore have been good. And if you get a 3/1 that draws you a card, draws you a land, or a 4/2 for 3, both are acceptable. And specifically in Golgari, because you're doing this kind of like, I'm playing a defensive strategy until I eventually overvalue you and overwhelm you with my mid-range threats. A 4/2 doesn't attack well if your opponent has a 2/2, but it does defend well because you can trade it into something with 4 toughness. And then we've got Huatli's Final Strike. And one last remark that I'd like to make is that single point removal hasn't done very well in the set. And that's because a lot of the 1 and 2-drop cards are really good. So if you're using a 3-cost card to remove a 1 or a 2-drop, you're losing on the mana value exchange. And similarly, there's also cards that are multiple cards in one. So if you look at like Cloud Guards spawning a 1/1, right? Like, there's a bunch of cards that are multiple rectangles in one card. And if that's the case, then using single point removal, you can't just trade 1 for 1. Eventually, you'll fall behind in value. And then last but not least, we've got the value over replacement for cards that will wheel. And this one, we start off with the Hidden Necropolis and the Hidden Nursery, which are the cave lands, black and green. And since you're not really planning on, starting the pressure on turn 1, then you can definitely afford to play caves, and you can go crazy and get like 10 caves if you want to do the cave strategy. And I think Golgari is actually a good base for that space. But yeah, so keep your eye out for caves, especially on the wheel. The Mineshaft Spider, notably, if you are doing the caves thing, you will have to value them a little bit higher. Like if you want to hit 10 caves, you're going to have to take them higher than on the wheel. But I've found that like in this archetype, and the stats suggest this as well, that if you want to just pick up a couple, planning to pick them up on the wheel is not the end of the world. The Mineshaft Spider is a card that really only works in Golgari because Golgari is really the only space that cares about filling the graveyard in green. And then 3/4 Reach is a pretty good body if you are up against the Azorius Flyers and is available on the wheel. In the Presence of Ages is another one that's Golgari specific because, again, it's the only archetype that really cares about filling the graveyard in green, and works really well if you are doing the cave strategy as well, because a lot of the caves work by counting the number of caves that are in your graveyard as well as in play, so to keep that in mind. And then Another Chance is a good way to enable your self-mill, as well as eventually outvaluing your opponent, because it's 2 cards in 1. You can just overextend your opponent's threats, and if your opponent's answering 1 for 1, then Another Chance can kind of leverage that. It is slow though, right? Like, you want to keep this in mind that like this is more like a 5-drop or a 6-drop than it is a 3-drop in your deck. And then Rampaging Spiketail is a good reanimation target. I think the Nurturing Bristleback is better, and but this is a good one that you can kind of plan to take on the wheel if you're not seeing the Nurturing Bristleback. And then lastly, we have the Cavern Stomper, and the Cavern Stomper is a card that I want to try to take. I want to start personally working on this myself, is taking it later, because I tend to see a Cavern Stomper and go, ooh, and take it way before the wheel. And then later I see them on the wheel and I take the Cavern Stomper there too. And then I have 2 Cavern Stompers and my top end is completely full, right? And same thing with Another Chance. I go, ooh, I want the Another Chance. And then by the end of the draft, I have 4 or 5 Another Chances. And I'm like, okay, well, I do not need to take this as early, right? So the other thing that's kind of nice about 17 lands and data in general is it kind of gives you an idea of when you can take these cards or how hard you have to fight for these cards. So next week I'll be covering another archetype, and if you have one that you'd like to see, let me know by voting on the poll on YouTube. And it does take a fair amount of time to put these presentations together, so if you found this episode helpful, please take the time to click like and subscribe and leave a comment. I really appreciate it. And if you want to go above and beyond, you can click join to become a YouTube member or subscribe on my Patreon. And thank you for watching to the end of the video. Good luck with your games and future trophies, and thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next week.